Sylian Chronicles. Book 1. The New Order. Prologue. Even in the middle of summer, at the height of the heat, the water always remained cool. From a young age, he loved walking on the banks of his lake. He would sit on the short-cut green grass, remove his shoes, and dip his bare feet into the water. He could spend hours splashing around, while observing the landscape around him, the trees and their foliage rocked by the breeze, the high stone walls that bordered the family estate, and finally the manor in which he lived. Sometimes he would bring a book and lie down on the lawn, sometimes he just daydreamed while looking at the birds that had taken up residence in the park's foliage. From time to time, he even managed to forget the guards in their navy blue uniforms who watched him from a distance. They were still there, somewhere, watching him. Of course, over time, he could have gotten used to this permanent presence. He had been suffering from it for almost 10 years now, and only a few distant memories made him understand that life used to go differently. In one of them, he saw again, as if through a mist, the spectacle, both strange and terrifying, of the first rite of passage he had witnessed. He must have only been 3 years old at the time, but he remembered the man who was kept lying on the black marble altar. He was screaming, and vermilion blood gushed from his arm before spilling onto the ground and trickling down to the boy's feet. Not far from him, his father, tall and stern, dressed in a rich blue suit, his ebony hair curly and impeccably styled, stood straight, his face impassive as he watched the scarlet liquid flow. This faint reminiscence seemed to be only a dream, and sometimes he thought he had simply invented this scene, the stories he had heard having ended up igniting his imagination. Yet in this evocation this red blood seemed so real. If that memory ended there, everything else he had learned about his family's past had been told to him by his mother. She wanted him to keep everything in his memory, not to forget any detail, because he had to do what was expected of him. He was the son of the goddess. At that time, he could not understand how he, a modest boy of flesh and blood, could be the child of this strange white marble sculpture that stood motionless in the entrance hall of the mansion. Because for him, the goddess was only this statue whose merciless gaze measured each visitor as soon as they came to the house. As he grew up, he understood that his family had not devoted unfailing worship for generations to a simple decorative object, but to a superior, immaterial, and very powerful being. Despite everything, one detail disturbed him. His mother had explained to him that their divinity saw through the eyes of the sculpture and that, when she did not like a new guest, lightning flashed from her marble fingers to strike down the impudent person who dared to enter under the roof of the house of her most faithful servants. The boy had never witnessed this, despite the fact that for years the mansion had been constantly invaded by unwanted visitors. He had often wished that the goddess would manifest her powers and defeat the agents of the Confederation who kept him and his mother under constant surveillance. He hated them to the highest degree ever since he was old enough to understand that this damn Confederacy, about which he knew almost nothing, was responsible for his father's death. This resentment pushed him to regularly escape the control to which he was subject. Over time, it had become easier and easier, not only because as he grew up he had managed to perfect his different techniques to go unnoticed, but also for the good and simple reason that their guards realized less and less their job well. The latter considered this uninteresting routine as a punishment to be endured. What danger could a child and a woman under permanent house arrest represent? An agent of the powerful Confederation of Planets had other tasks to accomplish, much more important and rewarding than this one. In contrast to their lack of motivation, her mother had assigned herself an obligation that she refused to shirk. She spent most of her time teaching her son everything he needed to know about their cult. She had him learn by heart the entire ritual of the acceptance ceremony, the practice that allowed new followers to enter the faith. She had even managed to hide the sacred book, before the agents thought of confiscating it. On the first page there was an illustration of the goddess. Her hard face and her strange pale blue eyes showed no compassion. When she wasn't teaching him the basics of worship, his mother confided their family secrets to him. Throughout the mansion, there were many hidden passages. One of them actually led outside the property. She had shown them to him, and when he asked her why they didn't use them to escape, she replied that it was much too early for that they had to wait until he grew up a little. In the meantime, secret passages served to hide the family's most precious objects. The guards, aware of their total impunity, did not hesitate to cheerfully loot anything that might have a little value. Even though the planet had much less advanced technology than the rest of the galaxy, the interior of the mansion still contained a veritable gold mine. The boy's family, noble for generations, had amassed priceless possessions. Paintings, silverware, and old books had disappeared over time to be resold undercover. This further fueled the anger he felt toward the Confederacy. More than any other child, he wanted to grow up quickly, in order to deal with this cursed organization that governed his life. He counted with some impatience the days separating him from his 13th birthday, because the number 13 was that of the goddess. At the time when their religion still existed, boys and girls, who aspired to enter its service, had to present themselves to a priest at the beginning of their 13th year to follow the apprenticeship. 13 years of ignorance, 26 of initiation, and 39 of happiness. If for several hundred years the life of a believer had been organized in this way, everything changed overnight when the people, tired of suffering in silence, managed to find enough courage to defy their nobility and appeal to the Confederation to report their mistreatment. A magistrate then commissioned an investigation, and in view of his conclusions, he declared the cult barbaric and cruel before sending the clergy to prison planets and sentencing senior officials to death. This is the punishment suffered by his father, while he and his mother, considered potentially dangerous, would have to remain cloistered in their home for life, with the only outside contact being an annual visit from a few selected family members by judges and considered acceptable. Every year, on the occasion of his birthday, he had the pleasure of seeing his uncle, his aunt, and his cousin. He loved his cousin very much. She was only 2 years older than him, and radiated a joy of life that he hardly knew. Her bright red hair looked like great flames dancing around a never-smiling face. Apart from her, he didn't spend time with any other children. She taught him games and told him stories, brightening his life for an entire day. As for his aunt, a plump woman with hair as red as her daughter, as soon as she saw him, she took him in her arms, and year after year tirelessly told him the same thing. "But look at this. How you have grown and how beautiful you are. You have the most magnificent eyes in the Confederacy. It looks like the blue of the oceans of our world." To which his mother couldn't help but add with pride, "He has the eyes of our goddess." "Let's see, dearest," her aunt inevitably replied, "they are navy blue, those of our beloved goddess are much lighter." Usually his mother didn't respond. She just looked at him strangely, as if she knew something she'd rather keep to herself. Of course, this same routine was repeated on the long-awaited day of his 13th birthday. The sun shone in a cloudless sky and only a slight breeze cooled the atmosphere. His family, arriving late in the morning, wanted to take advantage of this radiant weather by sitting on one of the tables not far from the lake to have a leisurely lunch. When the meal was over, he lay down under a tree and listened to his cousin, sitting on the green grass beside him, recount the latest news from the outside world, an astonishing world full of spaceships faster than light, immense commercial and pirate conglomerates organized within a brotherhood. Several hours passed like this, and while his mother had suggested that his sister and his brother-in-law come home to have tea, his cousin, thirsty from her stories and the heat, had temporarily abandoned him to go searching of a cold drink. Nearly a quarter of an hour later, the boy, noticing that she was not coming back, began to get impatient. Annoyed, he in turn returned to the interior of the building. Why was it taking so long? He had thousands of questions to ask her, and she was only there for 1 day. Every minute was precious, they should not waste any. He entered the great hall and mechanically gazed at the statue of the goddess which sat in its center, Her lifeless eyes seemed to stare at him impassively. He looked away and walked to his right. A long corridor with dark wood paneling led to the closed kitchen door, probably where his cousin would be. As he approached, he heard a man's voice muttering something, then a series of muffled wails. He quickened his pace, intrigued, and opened the door wide to discover a sight that, at first, his mind refused to understand. A guard held his cousin's wrists with one hand and held the other over her mouth to prevent her from screaming. Meanwhile, the second officer kept trying to pull down the girl's pants. She was struggling as best she could, but she was no match for her attackers. "Please help me," she managed to articulate, partially freeing herself from the embrace. His blood boiled and he threw himself at the man who was trying to undress her. He hit him with all his might, but the other, barely embarrassed, laughed as he turned towards him. With a sharp gesture, he pushed the boy who fell to the ground. "What do you want, you dirty little brat?" the individual exclaimed with a fierce smile on his face. "You have no right," the boy shouted. "We have all the rights. Do you think the Confederacy cares about you and your family of degenerates?" He got up and lunged at the agent. A brief struggle ensued, during which he felt his fingers brush against the energy weapon his opponent carried on his belt. In a fit of rage, he grabbed it and pointed it at the person's stomach. The latter immediately collapsed to the ground screaming, his hands clutching his perforated stomach. The boy noticed with surprise that the Confederacy's blasters did not draw blood. The guard now had a black hole of charred flesh, while a sickening smell was quickly spreading throughout the kitchen. The other man, petrified for a moment, let go of the young girl he was still holding and dodged a gesture to take his blaster. The boy was more lively than him. He pulled the trigger and watched, with a strange detachment, the energy beam shoot out and pierce the torso of his opponent, who in turn collapsed. His cousin collapsed, sitting on the tiled floor, was crying and hiccuping, her trembling hands pressed to her eyes. He grabbed her wrist and forced her to her feet, which she did with difficulty. The agent with the punctured stomach continued to scream, and we could now hear the sounds of a stampede in the corridors. He suddenly realized the significance of what he had just done, but he still forced himself to remain calm to think. An idea arose in his mind: take the secret passage that led outside, towards freedom. When he wanted to leave the kitchen, another guard who came running blocked his way. Again, the boy shot first. This time, to ensure the result, he coldly decided to aim for the head. Jumping over the inert body of his adversary and refusing to look at his mutilated face, he dragged his cousin towards the living room. There was the closest secret route leading outside the property. They had to get out quickly. We wouldn't forgive him for his last actions. These bad guys were going to kill them all. They had to flee as quickly as possible if they wanted to stay alive. Only a few seconds of frantic running through the corridors of the mansion were necessary for them to arrive in the room whose door was ajar. With a push of his shoulder, he pushed it violently and noticed that it was here that his mother, his aunt and his uncle were having tea under the supervision of two other agents of the Confederation. Seeing the boy rush in with his weapon in hand, they immediately took out their own blasters and took aim. His terrified mother jumped up in an unconscious reflex to intervene. It was she who was shot by the guards, and she collapsed, dead before she even reached the ground. Still with strange detachment, as if all this no longer really concerned him, he fired in his turn, hitting one of the men, but missing the other. Her aunt, stunned, barely realizing that her sister has just been killed in front of her, remained seated, her eyes bulging, and unable to make the slightest sound. Then, she clapped her hands to her mouth, horrified, unable to do anything except stare at the lifeless body lying on the floor. His uncle, on the other hand, with astonishing composure, rushed to help his nephew. With his fist, he violently hit the still-standing guard in the jaw just as the latter took aim again. The deflected shot hit the ceiling and created a small blackish crater. "Run away!" his uncle yelled, trying to control his opponent. Go away. Quickly. While his cousin had found refuge in her mother's arms, he hurried towards the entrance to the secret passage. Using a fake book hidden in the library, he activated the opening mechanism. It rotated an entire section, revealing a dark corridor. He crossed the threshold and, without waiting for the piece of furniture to gradually return to its initial position, he continued his flight. He flew down several steps until he reached a long tunnel dug directly underground. He ran like this for several dozen meters, not daring to stop or look behind him. Soon, the darkness forced him to slow down. A few small shafts of light allowed him to see where he was going, but he couldn't make out the details of his surroundings. An unpleasant smell hung in the air. On the ground, numerous puddles languished, while here and there roots made progress difficult. The humidity and cold turned the dirt on the walls into a viscous texture, and after brushing against them with his hand several times, the boy did everything possible to avoid further contact. There was something disgusting about them, as if these walls constituted the interior of a filthy, dirty, and slimy beast. After several minutes, out of breath, he saw the exit partially hidden by vegetation. With difficulty he made his way outside. He was now in the forest adjacent to the property, and from what he could see, there was no immediate danger. No sound came from the tunnel behind him. The officers did not seem to have noticed the movement in the library. Out of caution, he still decided to move away and plunged towards the heart of the wooded expanse. He walked like this, aimlessly, for several hours. He felt like he was going in circles, but he wasn't entirely sure. In his head, he constantly replayed the images of the events he had just experienced. He saw himself shooting the guards several times. He thought he had eliminated at least 2 of them, but did not feel the slightest trace of regret, quite the contrary. After all, these people had gotten what they deserved. The Confederacy had murdered his father, the Confederacy had held them prisoner for years, the Confederacy had pillaged their home, and just hours earlier the Confederacy had killed his mother. These individuals were simply evil. They were exposed to a just sentence of death. Immersed in his thoughts, it took him some time before he realized the hunger that was beginning to overwhelm him. He felt tired too, but refused to stop. Looking around, he noticed some bushes with a strange green berry growing on them. He hesitated. Could he eat these fruits? To tell the truth, he didn't have the slightest idea. It had been years since the agents stole and then sold the botanical encyclopedia that was once located in the library. He had never had the opportunity to look through it. He doesn't think for long. Hunger overcame his reason and he picked a few dozen green berries and swallowed them. He found them very tart, but of acceptable taste. It was only after a few minutes that he realized that they were not entirely edible. A violent pain in his stomach forced him to lie down at the foot of a tree. It was so strong that he wanted to scream. He closed his eyelids for a moment, and when he opened them again, he saw the forest dancing around him. The trunks bent gently in the breeze, like reeds in the wind, and he felt the earth move beneath him. Nothing seemed stable anymore. Tiny flying insects came and sang a delicate and strange chant in his ears, as if they were trying to ease his pain. A bird with colorful plumage landed near him and began to formulate words in a strange language. "Tell me, little man, you seem very ill," exclaimed the bird, hopping towards him. "You're just a bird," the boy replied, holding his stomach. "You can't speak." "Of course I can," said the animal indignantly. "But I find you rude, little man, so I'm leaving." With that, he flew off, leaving the boy alone. "A bird doesn't talk," he repeated out loud. "This is not possible. What is happening to me?" He was in pain, so bad that he wanted to cry, to scream, to hit. He felt the earth move more and more beneath him. She seemed alive and she wanted to envelop him, engulf him, but it also seemed cool and pleasant, and he finally relaxed. He felt the call of sleep. All around him, the landscape gradually faded and he saw only moving mists forming strange patterns. As he looked at them to try to understand their meaning, he noticed that his stomach no longer hurt at all. In fact, he no longer felt pain anywhere. He just felt tired, very tired. After all, he had walked for very long hours. He could take a break, just a little break, and then he would go again. Little by little, he let himself slip into sleep. "You are dying." It was a woman's voice, unpleasant to hear, harsh, cold and sharp as the blade of a sword. The boy suddenly opened his eyes. He saw the white shape leaning over him and recognized it immediately. The goddess. She looked exactly like the sculpture in the hall, and stood there, just overhanging it. Her milky white pupils stared at him so intensely that he felt a sharp pain in his head, as if that powerful gaze were piercing his brain. "Do you want to live?" the animated statue asked. He did not have the strength to answer. She hurt him so much. Each of her words lacerated his ears and her implacable gaze burned him horribly. He tried to move to escape it, but she was having a greater will. A grin appeared on the face of the strange sculpture, revealing a row of sharp teeth. He didn't know she has such teeth. He had never seen her smile before. "You will live, my son," she said. "And you will achieve what I expect of you." The suffering increased a notch. His eyes burned horribly. "Isn't that right, my son?" she continued. "Yes, mother," he whispered. "I will do whatever you want." She burst into a sadistic laugh and he immediately put his hands to his ears. That laugh hurt even more than the words. He felt like his eardrums has been punctured and blood was pouring out. He couldn't hold on any longer. His breathing became labored and he bit his lip to keep from screaming. "Very good," the goddess murmured, "let me tell you what I expect from you.